Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Redmen TV. I'm Chris Pajak. I am delighted to be joined by former Director of Research at Liverpool Football Club, Ian Graham. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me today and chat about your book. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here and talk to you.
No problem. So we'll get straight into it then. First question I've got to ask, of course, is what made you want to write the book?
When I started working in football back in 2005, there wasn't much data, and there was certainly no interest in football data or football data analysis. In the past sort of 10, 15 years, there's been a real explosion of interest in it. But I think it's still a kind of marginal interest. So I really wanted to write the book in order to kind of bring the story of what football data analysis is to a wider audience. And then the sort of the hook that I've got to be able to bring that to a wider audience is that I worked for Liverpool for 11 years, where we used data to help our performances. So yeah, I really wanted, your typical football fan to know a bit more, appreciate a bit more about what data analysis is, what it isn't, um, what the data is, how we approach improving performance through it. And using that Liverpool story as hopefully an interesting application of it. There's a lot of sort of misconceptions and a lot of myths. Sometimes the research department in Liverpool refers to as geniuses, and we weren't geniuses. We worked hard and did good work, but I wanted to kind of tell the full story to just say, this is what the project was, this is what we did. There's no magic involved. If you understand data, understand a bit of mathematics and statistics, you can get an insight into football that you wouldn't otherwise have.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, I've loved this side of the game for a long time now. Particularly have a real acute interest in it, in fact, Ian, and wanted to talk to you for years, but obviously had absolutely no way of getting a conversation with you. But one of the things that I've realized when I read your book is, and what may allay a few fears for people is, I love the data side of the game, but I do not have an understanding of statistical mathematics or anything like that. Um, and I've read Will Spearman's paper on pitch control as well years ago. I couldn't understand that. It was too much for me. But your book was written in a way that I could actually understand what you were talking about. It's one of the best things I think you did with the book.
That's a really nice compliment, and that's what I was aiming for. Was to give anyone an insight into it. You don't have to have a maths A level or a physics degree or a PhD. The maths is complicated and it's rigorous. The data is big. You get like a million rows of data per game with tracking data. It's big and complicated and difficult to handle. But the important thing is that the ideas behind it are not difficult to understand, and any fan of the game should be able to understand it, and it should speak intuitively to how the fan understands the game. I think the physicist Feynman had some sort of quote about theoretical physics, right? That was along the lines of, if you can't explain your theory to a guy that you're talking to in the pub, that means you don't understand your theory. You haven't sort of thought through it properly. And so part of the book really was an exercise for me as much as anything. Do I understand this stuff well enough to be able to explain it to someone who's not necessarily a data expert or a mathematician?
Well, I think you did, and I think you do. Yeah, we'll get into it. I've got loads and loads and loads of questions. I want to cover as much as possible. But tell us a little bit about your background, obviously before football, and how you came into football and into Liverpool, please.
Yes, so I was born in South Wales. At at school, I hated sport because rugby was the sport that we played. I'm got far too sensitive a nature to enjoy rugby. So football was kind of the outsider sport in my part of South Wales in the 1980s. Always good at maths and science. Went to do a physics degree in Cardiff, did quite well at it. Went on to do a physics PhD in Cambridge, looking at biological physics, so studying some of the proteins in a bacteria called E. coli that can give you a nasty dose of food poisoning. Um, and I was kind of going down the track of being a unsuccessful scientist. Um, if you're a research scientist in Cambridge, being quite smart doesn't really cut it. You need to be like among the smartest people in the world, which I wasn't quite at that level. So I happened to see an advert saying, "Do you want to do football stats for a living?" I didn't realize such a thing existed. So applied for the job. I think I was employee number 4 or number 5 at a small startup called Decision Technology. And the football stats, the way we made our money through football stats was writing a column for the Times called the Think Tank. So every Saturday we'd take some sort of question, home advantage, or do substitutes matter, or which managers make good substitutions, and apply a sort of data approach to it. And so that was my entry into football. Once a week, we had to think of a research topic, do the analysis, and then hand it over to the journalist Danny Finkelstein, who wrote the column in the newspaper. And then through that, we started working with bookmakers. Betting was a big early adopter of data in football. And eventually, Damien Comolli, who was director of football at Spurs, got in touch. And so started working consulting for Spurs for 3 days a week. So there was a lot of luck involved. If I hadn't seen that advert, if I hadn't been quite unsuccessful as a scientist, um, I wouldn't have really got started in football. And really, a career as a football data analyst didn't exist at the time. It was kind of the first job, one of the first jobs ever advertised for that role.
Okay, so what about Liverpool then? How did you come to be at Liverpool Football Club, Ian?
So we signed up. We'd done bits and pieces of work for Spurs in 2007, but it was the end of that 07-08 season that Damien signed us up to a longer term deal. And then Spurs sold Berbatov, um, and unexpectedly sold Robbie Keane to Liverpool. I don't know if you remember that fantastic
I
transfer.
remember it. I got his name and number on the back of my shirt, and honestly have regretted it ever since. It's the last player I ever got on the back of a shirt, Ian.
As a Liverpool fan working for Spurs, I was sort of quite pleased that he went to Liverpool. The price was questionable, and that's why Spurs sold him. The price was too good to turn down, but a very good player. But for whatever reason, Benitez just didn't play him. And if you think we lost out on the title by, was it 3 points that season?
Oh
If
yeah, yeah.
if we'd kept Keane or he'd played a few more games, maybe couple of those draws would have turned into wins. Um, and so, yeah, there was a huge upheaval at Spurs. Pavlyuchenko and Keane were replaced up front, but sorry, Berbatov and Keane were replaced by Pavlyuchenko and Fraser Campbell, Man United's like youth prospect. And the season started terribly. Damien was blamed for the poor transfer window, and left Spurs. And then after Fenway took over Liverpool, um, Damien was made director of football at Liverpool. We were still working for Spurs, but Damien was keen. He thought we added some value when it came to understanding player performance, which players to look at, and which players to ignore in the transfer market. So he was keen to bring us to Liverpool. And he was also working with Michael Edwards at the time. So this gets a bit of a involved story. But Michael Edwards turned up at Spurs as Harry Redknapp's video analyst after Damien had left. Me and Michael worked closely together for a couple of years at Spurs. Damien then headhunted him to Liverpool. So I'd worked with the two people in football operations at the club. They were both keen to get decision technology working for Liverpool, but we were locked into a contract with Spurs, and there was no way out of that contract. So Damien had been kind of trying to figure out a way um, can he help us break out of this Spurs contract? and it seemed to be impossible to do. And then Damien left Liverpool. So Michael solved the problem of this decision technology contract by saying, well, we don't need decision technology, we just need Ian. And so he didn't, I should have realised really. Um, he invited me up to Liverpool to meet John Henry and Tom Werner um, to discuss this. Can we make something happen with decision technology? But the ulterior motive was actually we're going to offer you a job directly. So yeah, it was an interesting morning at the training ground. Kenny had just left that morning. Damien had left that morning. I turned up. There's no Damien was the person I was supposed to be meeting, and he's not there anymore. So instead, met John Henry and Tom Werner, and they offered me the job. And as a Liverpool fan, you don't say no to that job offer.
I can totally imagine. It was quite a blunt way of Michael Edwards solving the problem, but effective nonetheless.
Yeah, blunt but
So that,
effective is that's Michael all over.
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into the sort of nitty gritty of it. Obviously, you talk through this at length, but before I do, I just want to pick up on something you said when you mentioned Robbie Keane a minute ago. You mentioned the transfer fee and it being too good for Liverpool to turn down. I think sometimes in a fan's head, and I'm certainly very much a fan here, we place an ideal transfer fee on a player based on past performances. Now, would I, correct me if I'm wrong here, would I be right in saying that that's not how a football club would look at it and potentially more based on their future performances rather than their past performances? Same would probably go for a contract. A contract to a 30-year-old player, they might have the experience, but what is their future performance actually worth to the football club? So when you say that fee was too big for Robbie Keane, what are you actually saying there?
Yeah, so in in financial services, if you're buying some stocks or something like that, there's this disclaimer that comes along with it that says past performance is no indication of future results. The whole concept of data analysis in football is that past performance is a predictor of future results. If you've seen a player perform to a certain level at a certain standard of opposition, like in French Liga or Serie A or wherever, then you can estimate what his performance might be like in the Premier League. And you can also estimate what a player's performance might be like in 5 years' time or in 2 years' time. So the typical pattern is if you're signing a young player, 21 to 25, let's say, you can expect their performances to increase. If you sign a 27-year-old, you're signing a player at the peak of his powers, and his performances will decrease only slightly on average, but they will decrease. And as a player hits his 30s, it's very position dependent. What typically happens is the drop off in performance is quite mild. The problem is the number of games players start per season. So as you head into your 30s, it's the number of minutes that you can play more than your performance in a game that you're starting that is the issue. The drop offs in minutes rather than performance, and we're trying to attach a price to those things. So when you buy a 21-year-old, you're not just buying his performance today, you're buying the promise or the estimate that he'll improve in the future. When you're buying a 27-year-old, I can't remember exactly how old Keane was, but I think he was 27. You're buying that player today, and you can't buy that player and expect his performances will improve. And the transfer fee should price all of that stuff in. So overpaying for old players is a classic mistake for football clubs. And those players are ones that fans often get quite excited by because it's like, wow, this guy's been great for years. Can you imagine if he came to our team? And then, yeah, maybe for one season or 2 seasons, he'll be great, but that money's not coming back. The other side of it is if you sign a younger player, there's always the opportunity to sell that player later on. If you sign a 29-year-old, you're probably not getting a transfer fee when they're 33 years old.
Okay, interesting. And then into the sort of the probably the entry level statistic for most football fans at the moment is expected goals. Obviously, I see, the application's not quite right in some of the big broadcasts on the television at the moment. I think it's fair to say. Um, but obviously this has been around for a long time in a few different variations, as you write about in your book. Obviously, how did your model come to be, and what factors does it take in? Obviously, the pre-strike and the post-strike, as well as the earlier iterations of iBob, which I'd never heard of until reading your book.
Yeah, wow, you really have read the book in detail. I'm impressed. Uh, so yeah, you start off the way I like to think about expected goals is you start off with actual goals, which is what we really care about. Um, uh, so take one step back from goals. Well, usually, not always, but usually you need to take a shot in order to create a goal. And on average, 9% of shots become goals. So your very, very basic expected goals model will say there's a 9% chance. If you take a shot, there's a 9% chance on average of that becoming a goal. And then every um, extra complexity you add to that just takes each shot away from that 9% baseline and moves it higher if it's a better chance than average or lower if it's a worse chance than average. So the overriding factor in expected goals is distance. That's the if I want to choose one thing about a shot, I want it to be closer to goal rather than further away from goal. Um, and that was the major factor in my first expected goals model. The major factor in Reap and Pollard published the first ever expected goals model back in '97. And my IBOB model, which stands for in box, out of box model, was because we didn't have at the time the exact locations on the pitch that the shots were taken from. All we had was number of shots taken, and that was split up into inside the box, outside the box, direct free kicks, penalties. And it was obvious to me at the time that those are four very different sort of chances of scoring. So your penalty is about 75 to 80% chance of converting. Um, Outside the box is a lot lower chance of scoring a goal than inside the box. Um, Direct free kicks are about 12%, 10 to 12% conversion chance, which sounds low, but it's above your average shot conversion chance. And it's way higher than your outside the box shot conversion chance. And so as more data comes available, what we do is test, does that data make any difference? Does it improve our predictions? We're trying to use all the information at our disposal to predict will this shot become a goal or not. So things like um, are you under pressure from an opponent? That's the second most important factor. How tight is the angle? How much of the goal mouth you can see? Um, Headers are a lot worse chances than kicked shots. So you've got a lot less control over a header. Headers tend to come from closer range. Scoring from range with a header is very, very difficult. And
Unless you're
then
Steven Gerrard.
unless you're Steven Gerrard, I think Luis Suarez got one against West Brom from the edge of the
Oh yeah,
box in the
yeah, he did,
13-14 season. I think he couldn't believe he scored that one. Um, so yeah, and with tracking data where you can see the positions of all of the players, your expected goals model can become that much more complicated. Well, I say complicated. The only reason we make things more complicated is that they give better answers. So when you can see the position of the goalkeeper, when you can see the position of the defenders, that allows you to be a lot more precise about how good a quality chance is this really. If there's a defender right in front of you, it's a much lower chance than if there's not a defender right in front of you. But interestingly, in the post-strike model, so that the post-strike model is mostly to measure goalkeepers. So when we talk about expected goals, we usually pause the action just before the ball is kicked. So you know everything about the shot, but you don't know how well the ball is being struck. You don't know the trajectory of the shot. Post-strike expected goals takes the trajectory into account. So we can see this goal is going straight down, this shot is going straight down the middle of the goal. this shot is going into the top corner of the goal. Those two shots have got very different chances of being converted into a goal. And if a defender's right in front of you, your chance of scoring is much lower. But if you manage to get the shot on target, i.e., the defender doesn't block the shot, your chance of a goal is higher. And that's because the goalkeeper's unsighted behind the defender. And all this stuff's like intuitive to a fan. But it's very nice to see those intuitive results come out in the mathematics.
You mentioned there the post shot, excuse me, expected goals is really about the goalkeeper. Obviously, you mentioned the book Hans, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Lightheart, Red Bull's global head of goalkeeping. I think
Yeah.
you wrote it down as. Um, how did he help to define that look and that model? There was obviously somebody else mentioned in the book who actually took it one step further, I think, and decided on the goalkeeper's position and where he was more important. You cited you can place a shot in the middle of the goal, but if the goalkeeper stood there, it's low. But if the goalkeeper's at the other side of the goal, it's actually a good place to put the shot. How did that all come about?
Yeah, so for many years we had this collaboration with Hans, who worked as a consultant for us. He was kind of had two he kind of had two hats on. He was our goalkeeper scout. You sort of typical scouts are football experts, but football experts are not necessarily goalkeeper experts. So any player, any goalkeeper who was anywhere near a shortlist for us, Hans would scout in great detail. Hans is a very analytical character, so his idea of scouting was very much to collect a spreadsheet of data about the player. And this was like a huge source of information to us because Hans was collecting things that the data providers weren't necessarily collecting. So things like goalkeepers' behaviour on crosses, data providers don't really tell you how often the goalkeeper's coming out for a cross. They'll sort of flag up an error if a goalkeeper came out when he shouldn't have come out. But what does that mean? It's just someone at the data collection centre saying, "Oh, I think the goalkeeper's made a mistake there." So to get a sort of consistent and coherent spreadsheet of goalkeeper data from a goalkeeper coach was a great source of information, and it really pushed our modelling on. And then, yeah, Dav, my colleague in the research department, improved the post-strike model. So my first version of it was if you're um, if you shoot the ball towards the corner, that's better than shooting down the middle. Dav noticed that the data provider, actually gave us the goalkeeper uh, information about his position.
You took that into account, I suppose, in your post-strike
Yeah,
model.
yeah. So when you know the goalkeeper position, you can add this extra piece of information, which is how far is the goalkeeper uh, from where the shot is going. So if the goalkeeper's off his line, sometimes the best thing to do is tap the ball into the middle of the goal. Most of the time, you want to put the ball in one of the corners. But if the goalkeeper's defending his near post too much, which is a sort of consistent pattern with goalkeepers, that means a shot towards the far post should be rewarded more than a shot towards the near post. Whereas my old model would say the far post and the near post shots were equally valuable. So the data Hans collected gave us something to compare against.
Mm.
He also wrote down his kind of coaching opinion on each shot as well. So we would pick out, the best instances and the worst instances and see what Hans had said in each of those cases. And some of the worst instances was like couldn't believe what the goalkeeper was doing in these cases. So it's like, okay, the data is kind of seeing something similar to what the expert is seeing, and that means always the data advantage is it can see all of the shots all of the goalkeepers in the world face. One expert physically can't watch that much video. The data gives you an opinion, a first opinion on all goalkeepers. And that really helped our shortlisting. So from a data point of view, these are the goalkeepers that look really good. Hans can go and do his more detailed work on those goalkeepers because things are always missing from the data.
Yeah, of course. And I'm actually reminded something else you wrote in your book. I wasn't going to ask you about this, but I think it maybe is pertinent at this point. You mentioned in one of the latter chapters about how AI is informing decisions at football clubs or is helping to improve maybe some decisions at football clubs. And you mentioned pose data.
Mm,
Is this something that's now being looked at in terms of goalkeeper? Because I had a conversation with Bruce Grobbelaar a few years ago about a goalkeeper at Liverpool Football Club in the past, and I won't name names because I don't think it's fair. But he mentioned that he didn't like his hand positioning. And so his hands, Bruce always thought your hands need to be there when you're approaching a one-on-one, but the goalkeeper's hands were down by his knees. And Bruce's opinion at the time was if the ball goes high, you've got a further distance to cover. It's quite a simple thing. Whereas if your arms are outstretched for a podcast listener, in a cross right now, it's easier to get high from that position than rather down by your feet. Is this something that the pose position is now being ingrained into goalkeeper stuff?
yeah, so I think it's too early to say that it's ingrained, but it's coming, and it will be ingrained in the next couple of years. So the pose data that we first got access to was from Champions League games. And yeah, you can see where a goalkeeper's hands are. You can see how he spreads himself. And a friend of mine, Sam Green, who used to work for Opta and now works for Hawkeye, he started using that pose data to view how much of the goal mouth the goalkeeper is covering. So in our model, we can see the goalkeeper's position, but it's just a point. So we sort of say, okay, the goalkeeper's here, and we've just got a rectangle basically of how much of the goal he's covering. What Sam has done using the pose data, it's like when Allison comes out, for example, and spreads himself, you can see projected back onto the goal mouth a sort of distorted version of Ali's gloves,
Like a
showing
pressing
how
shadow.
much, yeah, exactly, showing how much of the goal mouth he's covering. And in many cases, it's a lot of the goal mouth.
And was your statistical models and obviously the video analysis that Hans helped with, and I'm sure Michael Edwards in the video analysis department would have helped with. Was that key to bringing in Alisson Becker? Because at the time there was two rumored goalkeepers, wasn't there? Fantastic goalkeeper over at Atletico Madrid and Alisson Becker that were rumored to be the targets. What stood Alisson out there?
Yeah, so two fantastic goalkeepers, as you say. In my opinion, shot stopping is the most important facet of a goalkeeper's performance. The reason they're allowed to touch the ball is because keeping the ball out of the net's quite an important thing. And it was unusual to have two two young, really brilliant shot stoppers, and there was not much to choose between them in terms of shot stopping. Oblak, I think, had a little bit more experience, maybe just edged it in shot stopping. But allied to that, you've got style of play, which is very important to consider. And as brilliant a team as Atletico Madrid were and still are, they play in a they play in a low block. They don't have to worry about playing out from the back. The defenders and the goalkeeper don't need to worry about defending half a pitch as they play a risky high line. Whereas Roma, they didn't play quite like Liverpool, but they played a lot more of an open game. Good distribution and good sweeping was part of Alisson's game that he demonstrated at Roma. And that's not to say that Oblak couldn't or wouldn't be good at that. It was just that the way Atletico played, he never had to demonstrate that side of his game. So that made Alisson definitely the number one choice.
It's interesting, yeah. So just more of a risk, although two both fantastic goalkeepers, probably the two best in the world since the signings were made, obviously. So okay, the other big part of the book is the possession value models. I think this is, you know, is this maybe your biggest achievement? Would you say, in terms of the statistical department at Liverpool?
Yeah, I think the possession value model, so did the first version of it at Spurs, but then at Liverpool, really went back to the drawing board and improved it from the ground up, and had the luxury of working full time on it and being able to hire a team to help me work on it as well. That really that really drove our data analysis, particularly for recruitment, helped us understand the impact that players were having on the game. And then the, so that was used through to like 2018 after Will Spearman turned up. We spent years developing a tracking data model, but the principle of the tracking data model is the same. It's possession value. All we care about is measuring what the chance of scoring a goal is in this situation, what the chance of conceding a goal is, and given what you do next, how have you impacted that chance of scoring or conceding a goal? And all tracking data does is give you a much more accurate estimate of what those chances are. Because with event data, you can't exactly see where the opposition is. In the old days, you couldn't see if a player was under pressure when he was making a pass or not. On average, you got things right, but in one particular game, you knew you'd occasionally be overstating or understating the importance of one particular action. With tracking data, just means there's so much more signal because you're getting a more accurate reading of the scoring and conceding chances. It means you need less minutes to observe a player to understand how good are they, would they fit Liverpool's system, and so on. So those two possession value models, the first one driven by event data and then the second one driven by tracking data. That's what we spent probably more than half our time on at Liverpool, and that's what really um, drove recruitment. So shortlisting players from who looks good in terms of can they create goal scoring chances, can they stop goal scoring chances from being conceded.
I think, obviously, when I was reading the book, I was thinking about how you would have applied that inside the football club, and I couldn't help but think about Trent Alexander-Arnold and the edge that he might give you in a possession value model or in a pitch control model or a hybrid of them both because of the speed with which the ball travels from his foot, the distance and the accuracy that it can cover. Am I right in saying that, or am I overthinking it? Because your smile says I might be right here.
Yeah, no, you know, he's the best passer as a fullback in the world, best passing fullback in the world. And if you just say best passer, full stop, he's one of the best in the world. And yeah, I'm smiling because when you talk about the speed and the accuracy of the passes, that's exactly how the tracking model works. That's also something that you don't see in the event data. You just see the ball was here, now the ball's there. And with Trent, it would be okay, the ball's in the right back position, now it's on the left wing. That was a pretty big increase in goal scoring chance. What the tracking data can do is it can see the space to receive that players are in. And so how it currently works with Trent is players if we had infinite time to mm, develop the tracking model, each player would have their own individual skill in how hard can I kick the ball, how accurately can I kick the ball. But they don't. We just have this, typical accuracy with which players can pass. So the reason I say Trent's one of the best passers in the world is because um, the pitch value model, the pitch control, will look at his passing options and look at the 50-yard switch to the left wing and say, nah, that's not on, mate. And then he'll complete it. And the fact that the model has said that's not on and he completes it, he's continually completing passes that the model says should not be completed. So the model saying, okay, you proved us wrong, and he keeps on proving the model wrong, and that keeps on lifting his rating, you know, far above the average passer.
It's so interesting, and again, I love when you read things, and it starts you off on a path yourself of wow, okay, well, was this that or was this that and all that. So it's really interesting. I think the next thing I'd like to talk about is obviously the defensive ability in the data. I think it's well known to anyone who has a passing interest in statistics or more than a passing interest in statistics that defensive stats are very outcome based. I think it's fair to say, especially in the sort of freely available models. FB Ref, obviously, a huge data source. how important was tracking data in finding defenders that would work at Liverpool, be that Virgil van Dijk or Ibu Konate, Joel Matip?
Yeah, hugely important. So Matip and Van Dijk were actually signed before the tracking model was operational.
I bet you couldn't
And
help but go back and check though.
well, actually, Matip, Premier League, we only started getting tracking data in 2015, I think. So
Okay, so you couldn't.
I mean, today you can go back and get those old Bundesliga games and create tracking data from that old broadcast footage. So if you got a few grand to spare, you buy the data, I'll happily analyze it for you. The
I don't have a few grand to spend, so you're safe there.
the old event model, centre back was always the most centre back's the position that defending is the most important for, obviously. And with the old events data, because that defensive data was outcome based, you only saw the active interventions by defenders. And in the book, I talk about this Ridgewell problem.
Yeah,
Um, the first time I tried to develop this possession value model, Liam Ridgewell from Birmingham City was the world's best defender. He's a great player. He wasn't the world's best defender. Um, and yeah, the reason was you couldn't see what the defenders were doing off the ball, and that's like any fan can see the importance of off ball behavior, covering space, marking, without doing anything actively on the ball. So in the old days, we just spent lots of time and effort making estimates. We try to guess where the players are, but we can't directly see. And the result of it was that you need to see lots and lots of minutes of centre backs before saying anything. And there might be something about the system that you're not seeing. So if a team plays a particularly low block or a particularly high line, we might be underestimating the defenders in some way. So tracking data allows you to see where the defenders are off the ball. And the whole concept of pitch control is you can see when the striker makes a run in behind, the striker temporarily controls some of that space in behind. And if a pass arrives at the same time, then that's a very dangerous chance. So by being able to measure that space in behind, we can say something about defensive positioning, whether it's a high line or a low line. We can also say something about defensive responsibility. One of Virgil's great strengths and one of Canate's as well is they can be responsible for huge amounts of space because they've got the physical ability to cover that huge amount of space. The sort of effective but less mobile defenders who might work really well at Atletico Madrid, for example, we might have made, or the data might have, incorrectly recommended them for Liverpool because it couldn't directly see the spatial elements that are so important in defensive performance.
that's really interesting. I know you've only got a couple of minutes left, so I've got about 10 questions, so I'm going to decide which one of them I'm going to sort of go to. I think I've actually got a paragraph here. Open on page 153 of the book where you talk about triple threat player when you're talking about strikers. Obviously, I love talking about Roberto Firmino, Sadio Mane, and Mo Salah. And for the most part, I've now realised why my dad talks about the teams of the 80s still. And I know that I'll be talking about that team and boring my grandkids about them.
Yeah,
But can you just explain a little bit about the triple threat players and and why Firmino, Sadio Mane, and Mo Salah worked so well together in the data?
yeah. I mean, we didn't know that they would work together before we signed them, but the analysis we did suggested they might, and yeah, yeah, thankfully they did. The problem with football is there's only one ball, so every time you've got the ball, I don't have the ball, and vice versa. So Mo, for example, is a very high volume shooter. You want a high volume shooter in your team. If you're on a team that's not taking any shots, you're probably not going to be very successful. But if you've got that high volume shooter or finisher, then that means the second forwards that you bring in is going to have less opportunity to shoot because Mo is taking all the shots. You can say the same thing about Lewandowski, you say the same thing about Haaland. It's not a criticism that Mo's taking all the shots. I want Mo to be taking most of our shots. He's very good at it. But that means the second forwards that you have, when you analyze their performances, you can't just look at their XG, look at their shooting, and say, wow, he's taking 4 shots a game. Mo's taking 4 shots a game. That means we're going to get 8 shots a game from these two players. They each take chances from the other one. And so when I talk about a triple threat, it means that players can create chances for each other. So if you've got a forward who's a good passer and a good shooter and is good at carrying the ball forward, that means, well, first of all, they can create chances for each other. You don't mind that Mo is taking other players' chances because the other players are very good at feeding Mo. Mo is also a good passer. He can feed the other players as well. And the second big advantage is it's very difficult for a defender if you're facing Sadio Mane or Bobby Firmino or Mo Salah. They can decide to shoot, they can decide to try and beat you, or they can decide to pick a pass. Compared to a more one-dimensional player who you know is always just going to take a touch and try and shoot, that's an easier cognitive thing to try and defend. I know what you're going to do. You might be really good at it. It's still a difficult job for me, but it's less difficult than you being able to do one of three things. So the sort of multifunctional abilities of that forward line, it was very, a lot of luck was involved in assigning those three players, as I talk about in the book. Um, but to have three players who are triple threats up front is incredibly difficult to defend against, as we proved over many years.
Okay, and final question then. It would be remiss of me to mention Arne Slot. Obviously, you speak at length about how difficult it is to analyse manager impact on teams. Um, as a football fan, have you done any modelling on Arne Slot either prior to him becoming manager or post?
Well, it was a big privilege to work for Liverpool for 11 years, but it was a huge responsibility as well. And I am very happy to not have that responsibility on my shoulders anymore. So I've looked at Arnie as a fan, and
Okay.
today, I am a Liverpool fan, and it's nice to be back to being a fan. His final teams played really good football. He got a tune out of players that weren't household names. That story rings a bell. Um, I think, yeah, his style of football is great. He's shown he can get things out of players. He's saying all of the right things. From the casual conversations I've had with my friends that are still at the training ground, he's made a really good impression so far. So as a fan, I'm really excited. I love what Feyenoord did in the last couple of seasons. I'm really looking forward to seeing him. But that's just my opinion as a fan.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much, Ian, for taking the time. Obviously, you can get How to Win the Premier League. Is it still out on August the 15th?
It's out on August the 15th.
In all available, all good bookshops, some poor ones, and online?
Yeah, all good bookshops, but you can get it from a bad bookshop. I don't care, as long as you buy it.
I'd recommend if you're in Paris, Shakespeare and Company. I think it's the best bookshop in the world. If you've never been there, you should do. I'm sure they'll have How to Win the Premier League, and you get a little stamp on your book, which is a really satisfying thing when you're buying a book, Ian. So, listen, thank you so much for joining me. It really was an illuminating conversation, and I really appreciate your time.